All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paula Boland, and I am the President and CEO of the UN Association of the National Capital Area, one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA, serving over 1,000 members in DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. Our mission is to educate and mobilize support for a strong partnership between the US and the UN, a partnership that has never been more critical for a sustainable future. I hope you will consider joining our chapter, if not yet a member, and get actively engaged in our community. Please visit our website at unanca.org for more information about our program and activities. UNANCA is proud to be hosting today's parallel event to the 67th Convention on the Status of Women, known as CSW 67, focusing on innovation and technology for gender equality. This program has been organized by our advocacy committee at UNANCA, and I want to thank our Vice Chair of Advocacy, Gayatri Patel, as well as Co-Chair Danielle Dean for all the work coordinating and making this event happen, as well as our young professionals who has been helping promote it. Our lives depend on strong technological integration. Everything currently goes through a digital process, as we know. However, 37% of women do not use the internet. Almost 300 million fewer women have access to the internet than men, even though they account for nearly half the world's population. If women are unable to access the internet and do not feel safe online, they are unable to develop the necessary digital skills to engage in digital spaces, which diminishes their opportunities to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and other related fields. Bringing women into technology results in more creative solutions and has greater potential for innovations that meet women's needs and promote gender equality. Digital technologies have the ability to connect communities and raise the voices of human rights and civil rights champions across the globe. But they are also a platform for harassment and abuse, particularly against women and girls. As we see a troubling trend of online discrimination, gender misinformation, and violence targeting women and youth advocates, it is imperative to make digital technology safer so that all voices might be heard. Reversing this trend would require tackling the problem of online violence, which a study of 51 countries revealed 38% of women had personally experienced. Advocates are often targets of bullying and harassment online, but there are unique challenges and dangers for women and girls. Today's session will delve into efforts to integrate gender-inclusive strategies that address ending violence, online violence, and provide support to women and girls as advocates and leaders in public spaces. Thank you all for joining us today, to our panelists. And let me now introduce our program moderator, Yvonne Rivers, who serves as Vice Chair of Programs at UNANCA and CEO of Phoebe Marketing Group. Yvonne, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good day, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. By having a digital platform such as this, we're reaching that 7.9 billion people in the world. And I'm so happy to have I call a power-packed panel from across the globe. So you're gonna see this she empowerment this next hour. You're gonna hear this she empowerment about how we're taking charge and taking over, because you place a woman anywhere in the world and she will move the world. So Paula, I don't know if you want to introduce the individual speakers, or I will do that. Okay. Lucinda, I'm going to ask, as I call your name, make sure I pronounce your name right, just tell us a little bit about you and your organization. Lucinda, let's come to you first.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Lucina Di Meco, and I am the co-founder of #ShePersisted, an organization that works to address gendered disinformation against women in politics. And we do so through research and thought leadership, workshops, and supporting women political leaders increase their digital resilience and advocating for safer digital platform standards. We just issued a report called Monetizing Misogyny that looks at the connection between gender disinformation, backsliding of women's rights, and undermining of democratic institutions, with deep dives in 5 focus countries. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of our findings today.
Absolutely. You bring a breadth of opportunity and coverage with you. Cindy, we're going to go to you next.
Aloha and good morning. The sun is not up yet here, but it will be up by the end of our program. My name is Cindy Serrano Roberts. I'm a member of the United Nations Association National Council, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Global Freedom Group. And our mission is to empower women and girls around the world without borders. And we recently completed a report that did some research on access to women and the status of mothers on the Big Island. And what we really found, I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more today, is the divide between women who live in rural areas and in urban areas with access to technology and education. Thank you.
Very good, very good. We're going to go to Verena of the USA Department. Did I say that right, Verena?
Yes. Hi, good morning. I'm Verena Winder. I'm the Deputy Senior Official in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, which is situated within the State Department. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the many, many layers of bureaucracy of the US federal government, our office is really the sort of hub and center from which we advocate for the integration, promotion, advancement of gender equality, and particularly women and girls, through the conduct of all of our US foreign policy, whether that is in our policy development, and I can talk a little bit about that as we get into questions as it relates specifically to the topic today, as well as our programming, and by that I mean our foreign assistance investments overseas, as well as, and because we're doing this conversation on the margins of the CSW, how we think about raising many of these issues through our diplomacy, whether that's in bilateral conversations with just one other country or through the multilateral forum through which we engage, including through the UN. So delighted to be here. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Paola. Thank you, Gayatri. And really delighted to meet Lucina and Cindy and Stephanie, we've met online.
Very good. Thank you. Stephanie, let's come to you. Unmute yourself.
Hi.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for having us today. We really appreciate this convening. So my name is Stephanie Mickelson, and I focus on technology and gender-based violence. This has been my focus, my personal focus for the past 8 years, but now I'm gladly with UNFPA headquarters technical division as I sit on the gender-based violence team. Specifically, I focus on how to create safe and ethical technology, as well as the intersecting technology facilitated gender-based violence. Apologies, everybody, for that mouthful. And if I do use the horrible acronym, which I know we have way too many of, TFGBV, that is the terminology that we're using now. To give a step back, I know UNFPA is not one of the more popular UN agencies. So just to give some background, we are the UN Agency for Reproductive and Sexual Health with a strong focus on gender-based violence. We have a really strong footprint globally. We work in 153 countries and have pretty good relationships with governments and civil society organizations. As I mentioned, we work on GBV response and prevention, and now how to integrate technology and technology facilitated gender-based violence into all of our programs globally. I think one of our big pieces that got us on this road was our report on making all spaces safe, where we looked at what this intersection looks like, as well as how we can start to define it. We found 40 different definitions and types of this form. Offline, online, social media, but as well as text messages, dating apps, drones, spyware, and the Internet of Things, including location tracking. We've also at the same time started our Body Right campaign, which brings up the recognition that videos and songs have more credit online when we're talking about taking content down from social media platforms than we as humans, as women and girls, when we ask to have that content taken down, we don't have that same clout as the copyright. So therefore we have our Body Right campaign. More recently, we started looking internally at the technology that we within the field are creating. And we want to make sure that this technology is also not putting women and girls at risk. Because of course, when we talk about gender-based violence, like it means that we're collecting a massive amount of data.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I will stop there.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing a lot of other fun things, but yeah, I'm happy to discuss some of this with you all today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I like to start off by we're here for a reason. What is the problem? We know what the problem is. We're not getting equality in everything that we do, not just in online and so forth. And so that's a situation that's been going on for years. You know, even if we went back to here in the US, the Congress passed Violence Against Women Act in 1994. So we're talking about 28 years ago, we had legislature. Now we've got the digital platform, which we didn't have back then. And so we really have to monitor that. So I'm going to pose a question, and the question is pretty much not why are we here, but what can we do? What have you found in all your different organizations that you really represent here is that situation? Now, I've mentioned, a couple of you have mentioned reports per se, but the whole idea of this environment being set that you can be cyberbullied or whatever. What if, in your opinion, that this has come about, stats, to state some stats if you have it, or a period of time, over the last 10 years, 20 years, how has this come about? Because this is a problem. So how did this problem come about?
Dr. Rivers, if I may offer something through a diversity and inclusion lens, if you will, and something that our organization found when we conducted research on the status of women on the Big Island just a few months ago, it comes that we can't address this problem without looking at how both boys and girls are conditioned to access technology, the rate at which they can access technology. And there's 4 big divides here. We're looking at infrastructure. We're looking at computers, access to tablets or handheld devices. We're talking about training. And we're also now getting into, I believe that shapes the knowledge. How do we use this now that we can access it? Now that whether we live in rural communities or urban communities, how can we access it? And that's what we found in our research that really sort of sets the stage for how all these other things play out.
Absolutely, because in mentioning that 37%, only 37% of women actually have access to digital platforms with that. Someone else was going to chime in. Who is that? Someone else like to take on that? How did we get here? How do we get here? Cindy just addressed. Yes.
I think we are in this situation when it comes to online harms against women at all levels, because those a lot of those platforms and the tools that we're using today were designed by men. So this is clearly kind of like an underlining, situation. There is no doubt that if women had been in the room when some of those tools were designed, they would have realized the harm that it could have potentially been caused. And even today, within digital platforms, we see that very often women are relegated to what we might call the cleanup jobs, meaning, you know, the safety jobs, the jobs that have to do with content moderation, that, by the way, are the least powerful very often and the least paying and the most traumatizing. So there is that element that is for sure there. I think now it's important to think of how we can get also out of this situation. And I think that we're going to get out of this situation, but making sure that women are at the forefront of the negotiations for better digital platform standards, for example, and regulations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Because when we talk about being in the room, I love that term, because I say a lot of times the door is shut for women. I, being a Black woman in business 26 years, a lot of doors were shut for me. Guess what? I knocked until a door came down. And I came to the table and I brought my own folding chair. So that's what we have to do. But Raina, let's go to you about policy that you're talking about with the State Department. We're talking about global policy of setting the policy and being in the room. So address that issue.
Sure, thank you. I think if I can sort of maybe piggyback on the last question, one of the things that underlies both the lack of infrastructure investment in the four things that Cindy outlined, as well as the fact that women might not have been in the room in the beginning, like all of this comes back to gender norms, right? Like everything that we're discussing here can be linked to what do we think that women's role in public and private life can and should or could be. So I think that is where we ground certainly the perspective of GWE, or the Global Women's Issues Office. We think about gender equality, about actively pushing back on gender norms. So in terms of policy, I think one really important step forward is I think that we have recognized, and by we I do mean the U.S. government, have recognized that this is a real issue, that it's not just an issue where you can turn off your camera or turn off your Twitter notifications and it just magically disappears, but that the kind of harassment, abuse, violence really that takes place online is actual real violence, and it can lead to trauma, it can lead to real societal costs, like people feeling like they have to take out additional security measures. It might mean that you have to turn off your IP addresses and start over brand new online, right? There's some real significant costs. And I think that the US government is taking that seriously. I talked about our framing of this, and in our policy, we just put out earlier this, I think maybe it was December actually. In December, we launched our updated global gender-based violence strategy. And we've had one of these, you mentioned VAWA in 1994. We've had one of these strategies on the global side since 2012, and I was really glad to be a part of it then. And the world has evolved, not just since 1994, but since 2012, when I was involved in that drafting. And so one of the really significant shifts that we've made is recognizing and investing in technology-facilitated gender-based violence, TFGBV, as my colleague Stephanie just mentioned, as a real societal harm and as a real societal issue. One of the ways in which we're doing this, and we really highlighted this last week at the CSW high level week with an in-person event where we had the leaders of UNFPA, your boss, the leaders of UN Women, and the leader of UNICEF, so Kathy, Seema, and Natalia, all together talking about this as a real issue. So we're really raising this on sort of a global multilateral stage. We've also put this together. We've got about 12 countries now invested and together coordinating on principles and shared actions. We call it the Global Partnership to Address Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. Lucina's organization is a part of that. We're trying to really rewrite the rules of the road, so to speak, as to what are government's responsibilities, what are civil society responsibilities, and eventually, I hope that we can talk about this today, what are some of the tech platforms' responsibilities?
Right. Thank you so much. Coming to you, Stephanie, you mentioned 150 countries you're involved in with that. Tie into the how did we get here? What do we need to do? And you had brought up specifically, just by being on this platform, we're subject to bullying by talking about the issue. It's like they want to silence us. Talk about having that voice.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as a gender-based violence kind of expert in this space, I think we talk a lot about safety. We talk a lot about survivor-centered approaches. I think one of the big things that we have to recognize is that sometimes, the punitive path is not actually the best for a survivor and does actually put them in more harm. So as we, of course, need to find that balance of, speaking up, pushing back publicly, but also doing it in a way that's not compromising our own safety, or ultimately those around us. So that's where, we are focusing a lot on how do we do this safely and ethically. And that's where the guidance that we just wrote that was released last week is kind of talking about that prevention piece. For example, if you look at the youth today, I think we know that youth are getting, 80% of their content from social media platforms. They're getting it from YouTube, from TikTok. And if we are not recognizing how that misogynistic and sexist and racist content is getting to them, then ultimately we will be backsliding because of technology. So recognizing those types of harms and that can happen intentionally or unintentionally is a really huge piece that we're trying to bring to the forefront in all of our work. In addition to, supporting survivors at a really individual level, which is something that we all still need to really kind of map out. Because of course, at every country level, it's going to be different.
Thank you so much. You brought forth really a lead into my next question is, does the public know that they're being bullied? Do they know this is not okay? Or are our mindsets sort of brought from the very beginning of we're not supposed to be privy to, or that this even is an issue? Do you find that majority of people really recognize that this is going on, that it really is a problem? And how can we get a better messaging or whatever to them so they recognize?
I think if I can jump in here, and Lucina, really, you, I think, have done so much research on this, and so I'd be really, really eager to hear from you. But I can say from a personal perspective, and I don't know if we could see our attendees raise their hand, but I would be, as a quick survey, I'd be really curious to know, who on this webinar today has faced this, right? Who has taken themselves out of a conversation, off of a platform, out of a digital space because this is happening. We see that reflected in the data, right? So when we launched our global partnership, we did it on the basis that 85% of women and girls have reported experiencing some sort of online harassment, abuse, violence. I have to imagine that the figures are just as high or potentially even higher for people who identify as LGBTQ or plus. This is happening to, at the very least, 50% of the population on a regular and consistent basis. And we're seeing the effects of that already play out. I'm sure all of you saw the CDC study that came out, which really points, and I think that the quote, and I don't have it at hand, was sort of an overwhelming wave of violence and trauma for our youngest girls. For those of us who are raising girls on this call, it's horrifying and it's terrifying, and it has a direct link with the sort of rising use and proliferation of technology that Stephanie just mentioned. And I would say, in terms of, as somebody who has experienced it, I'm sure all of you have experienced it, it's not undeliberate, right? There's a wonderful quote from a paper that came out in Foreign Affairs last year that says something along the lines of misogyny and authoritarianism are not common comorbidities, right? They're just not, they don't just happen together. They are actually mutually reinforcing ills. And so this is part of a playbook to silence women, or to silence those who have not traditionally held power.
Thank you so much for that, Verena. Others, any other input with that? Lucia?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Verena. Absolutely. Over and over. I mean, by now we have interviewed over 100 women in over 40 countries in the last years, women in politics and women political activists, feminist activists. And what we hear over and over again is that, in fact, they feel that what they are facing right now online is actually much worse than what they ever faced before. So this isn't only about the same, situation and the social norms and realities that have always been there now being reflected in the online space. The online space is actually multiplying the harms, making them really much more pervasive and normalizing them in very many ways. So what we do here is that, of course, women notice, women are very much aware of what's going on online. At the same time, they're beginning to normalize it. And so many women are beginning to think that this is pretty much, for example, the cost of doing politics, the cost of being outspoken online. And unless you're willing to bear that cost, you should probably not consider, say, a political career or a leadership role. And we are seeing evidence more and more of actually young women renouncing leadership roles that just a few years ago they were looking at because of this. Over and over, we see the impact on women in politics and on their families. Rape threats against women candidates, young children, daughters as young as 9 years old are becoming an ever more common occurrence. And we are seeing that playbooks being used against women because it's really, almost guaranteed to actually have them reconsider certain political fights. And one more thing I want to say, and I think it also really, highlights what Verena was saying in terms of the playbook and the authoritarian angle. Through our studies, we looked at various women in politics around the world, and we found that not all women are targeted in the same ways. So it is women who oppose so-called strongman political leaders. It is women who fight for abortion rights and sexual reproductive rights, women who fight for minority rights and the human rights, for example, of refugees, women that are at the forefront of the fight for climate justice. Those are the people that are attacked with the most vicious attacks, with the strongest and most resourced and organized gendered disinformation campaigns. Because the misogyny in this case isn't only the motivation, it might be the motivation for some, but in many cases, misogyny is the tool that they use to carry out the attacks, because misogyny works, but the ultimate motivation is political. The ultimate motivation is undermining women's rights and undermining democracy.
Absolutely. When you talk about digital platforms, probably before it was a lesser amount of people you're dealing with, but digital platform, you talk about people from all over the world. So it's a good number of people there. And whether it is intentional, I will say that it is intentional to silence the voice, and we have to acknowledge that. So I did really think about Forrest if that wasn't there, because when you talk about Forrest politics, and you can address this and so forth, you mentioned, Verena, Forrest, people recognizing and maybe getting off a digital platform, but do they say anything afterwards? That's the question, because you can go away silently, but who are you going to use the voice? Or how are you going to use your voice? So paint the picture, if all of you will chime in, about how the world would look if we didn't have this. Just imagine young girls not being bullied. And what would it take? And I heard mentioned for is empowerment. I always speak about empowerment. You empower a woman and they can stand against it. So what's your stance on that? Any of you chime in?
Hey, I'd like to share what I have found in various spaces, working with the federal government, now with a nonprofit in the community, is the power of coalition. And I think UNA San Francisco chapter with the Ratify movement, if I can give a nod to them, they do an amazing job of forming coalitions in order to amplify the same message and voices around them. And I think that there's something there, because we oftentimes talk about allyship, and I think that you can have allyship within a broader coalition.
Yes. Yes, because that leads to messaging. What's the messaging that's being done? Because just as we've just said, for is when Lucina talked about political, because if we talk about political side, whether it's cyberbullying or just really addressing women political candidates, they're really judged on how they dress, where they're not looking at that man who wears a suit and changes his tie. You know, it's all different subtle ways with that. So any more comments in that regards? What will the world look like? What will it look like for young girls getting that empowerment? And I like what you said, Cindy, about for its collaboration, because we're all in this together by being XX and 2 XX chromosomes. We're really subject to this. So we really have to address it in whatever platform, whatever place with that. So what are some different messaging within the collaborations? We've got 4 powerful women with 4 powerful organizations. How do you see that in working together and really making the start of some change? We know it's not going to be overnight because it didn't occur overnight. So what are some steps to see how we can progress through this?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll jump in here. I mean, I think, I'm just echoing what others are saying, but this collaboration, working together, building these bridges across these gaps that are ginormous. I mean, if we think about the gaps between tech and social work and gender-based violence practices in general, I mean, of course, we have the gender divide, the lack of women in the room in these really instrumental places, but we also have an academic gap. I mean, technology is all about putting the real world into ones and zeros, into calculations, whereas, the social sector, I mean, has been more about qualitative research, more about discussions and personalities. And so these two worlds are just completely different. There's power dynamics when people get into the room that we've seen. Something that we've been doing at UNFPA last year, we had a first TFGBV Global Symposium where we brought experts, 80 different experts for 3 days from around the world. Because of course we need to recognize that technology is coming largely from the US, but the harms are really felt globally. And we talked about feminist tech, what it looks like, what that ideal looks like for technology. We talked about data and measurement, making sure that as we move forward in this space and we do our research, that we're doing it in a way that is safe. And also the laws and policies, making sure that laws aren't weaponized against women. In Pakistan, we've seen that when women came forward and we're talking about the harms online, the response was, well, then women just shouldn't be online. So, that in also when we're talking about like sexual rights activists, sometimes there is content that would then be taken down by the platforms. So using regulation that's actually human rights centered, survivor centered, I think is something that we really need to talk about as we move forward in this space together. Cybersecurity, for example, of course, we could imagine there are very few women in the room there. So how can they even understand the issues that are going on? It's built to protect company assets, not humans, and definitely not intimate partner violence.
So
I
what
think, Yvonne, too, one of the question that you're raising is really hard to answer, right? Because it's essentially counterfactual, but we can look at the evidence that we do have about what does women's leadership, what does women's participation, what does girls' empowerment actually lead to in the world, right? The State Department doesn't have an office of global women's issues because it's a nice thing to do. We have an office of global women's issues because it is a smart, strategic, and yes, based on human rights thing to do. And so there is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. You can look at Georgetown, you can look at inclusive security, you can look at a bunch of really Carnegie, really well respected at Harvard, really well-respected areas of research, and they will bear out time in, time out that when women are able to participate meaningfully in society, and particularly in political leadership, that those societies are more peaceful within their borders and more peaceful externally to their borders. There are similar data showing that, more diverse boards, et cetera, lead to better outcomes for companies. But right now we're literally talking about, well, what is the kind of world that we want to live in a time that we're coming out of COVID. We have sort of multiple crises going on at once, from humanitarian to climate. Women's leadership, girls' leadership really matters. And so if you have, I think PLAN International, the organization, the NGO, conducted a survey a couple of years ago just on gender disinformation. And they found that based on disinformation, the way that the question was worded was about disinformation. It wasn't about bullying, it wasn't about violence, it wasn't about targeted harassment. Just based on disinformation, 1 in 5 girls under 18 were opting out of engaging in politics or current affairs. I think it's if you have 20% of girls opting out that young, we are never going to get to this place where we can reap the benefits of a fully inclusive society. And by the way, that gender disinformation and that bullying doesn't stop, right? Even when we do get to that place where we have women leaders, you need only to look at New Zealand, for example, for the most recent example of what sort of perpetual trolling, online just attacks will do to a person's mental and physical fortitude to be able to lead their country, right? I think that what she said as she was stepping down was, I just didn't have enough gas in the tank. I mean, it is exhausting, right? We're exhausting the women and the girls who are able to just stay in the game.
Right, absolutely. And we're talking about online with intimidations and bullying and whatever. And just as we said, even those who are not on the digital platform, will they ever want to be more? When you mentioned for is that 20% opting out because there's too much to deal with. I do work in Africa, and I have a young Kenyan young lady. She's 21 years old, and she works for me. Her father doesn't know she works, and she says that if he did, he would take her money. I mean, this goes on. This is the reality of the world, and people need to know about it. So what steps can we take? What steps can be done of that? And I'm sticking on that word empowerment, because if women believe that they can get help with that, but it's hard not to have that help when people are basically running you off because you don't believe you have that support under you. So how can we address that just moving forward? And it's coming to some solutions that can be put into place.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say it's really important not to give, in some ways, a misogynist response to a problem of misogyny. The misogynist response to be to make the women responsible and accountable for what's going on against them online. So more and more we see, for example, digital platforms offering trainings to women, including women leaders and women in politics, on how to be safe online. And that mostly is how to use their reporting systems, knowing all too well that there is no accountability in the reporting systems. Today, you can report however many threats that you might be receiving online on platforms like Facebook. And you never know when those reports are going to be addressed. It could take a week. It could take more than 100 days in many countries where, in fact, we know that their content moderation teams are much smaller, very often actually don't even talk the language locally and are not really aware of a lot of the local customs. So the truth is that women right now, as much as we would like to support them, and as much as, there are tools that they can use to kind of respond and change the narrative, women can never be entirely safe online right now, unless we change the policies around digital platforms. We have seen important efforts being made in Europe in the context of a legislative framework called the Digital Services Act that demands greater transparency, greater accountability, greater risk assessments from digital platforms. And I think that those are really important steps. I also want to say, really borrowing an example that I first heard Professor Mary Ann Franks making, and I think it's a brilliant one. What we need to ask from digital platforms is nothing new. It's nothing extraordinary. It is the very same asks we have for each and every industry in the world. So if I have coffee here in my mug, I do trust and hope that someone went into the factory producing that coffee to make sure that it did not contain poison, that some tests were made, and someone is controlling what's inside there. So that before even it reaches the shelves, we are sure it's going to be safe. And if someone ends up getting sick or dying out of this product, the company is going to be held accountable. The product will be recalled. We have allowed the digital platforms to run wild. And, as one of their earlier mottos was, go fast and break things, including breaking democracy, breaking, frankly, many women's lives. We can no longer allow for that to happen. We are not asking for anything extraordinary or, very difficult. We are asking pretty much for the same safety being put into place that we ask from each and every industry in this country and in the world.
Thank you. That leads to my next question. Thank you so much, Forrest Lucina, with that. Because my next question is, what can organizations do? I'm going to bring you in, Stephanie, and talking about what is the United Nations relating to the FPA can bring in advocates and organizations to bring more support. So how do you see your organization helping to really bring some calls to actions, and just as Lucina just said, and asking for this? Because we're not asking for anything new. I guess the power of the people, the power of the numbers, the power of the data that you have, you've got the numbers to show it. So how can that move things forward with actually coming to a call to action? What are some steps? We want some takeaways of what we can do with this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as we've been saying, bridging this gap of the fields is extremely important. I think, but also, recognizing that the work that we do needs to be based in feminist theory, which ultimately is bringing in intersectional identities, bringing in, and recognizing all of the organizations that have been working on this forever. I mean, one of the organizations that we work very closely with that we always try to push the work forward is the APC, the Association for Progressive Communication. They've done a lot of work on making sure that organizations are heard in the space, and the digital rights space in particular, within their countries, but also globally. They started a fund called the Newman Fund, which is funding specifically technology, feminist technology, and making sure that it's not your parachute in type of technology when we're talking about development settings where donors come in and think that this is the best type of technology that we need for this context, but actually involving people who are close to those needs, and making sure it's centered around that. As far as kind of our takeaways go, I mean, I think coming off of CSW right now, it is countries that are really leading this text that will then ultimately, I should say the Commission on the Status of Women. I guess we've been in the CSW so much that I try not to use the acronyms, but that this text that's going to come out of this is really important. And as much as countries are grappling with this new space, we need to exercise that within our countries and our organizations as well, and move forward and speak up and be heard.
That's it. Use your voice. You use your outside voice.
Yes.
Use your outside voice with that. Now, personal question I want each one of you to ask, because you're in this every day, 24/7. How do you do your own self-care to continue to do this work? And then we're going to lead to and ask the question, what can individuals, associations, community associations, stakeholders, what can we the people do to help? So first of all, how do you keep yourself engaged to keep doing this important work? What's your self-care technique?
Well, Yvonne, I can jump in. So what I have found is preventative care is always the best care, like when we're, looking at a car or something like that. And so I try to make sure that every day, great days, tough days, that, I have a regimen and I'm making sure that my cup is filled. And the other thing that I do is I try very, very hard in the midst of a busy world to continue to stay connected in community, because I think when we experience this doxing and targeting, it can be devastating.
Yeah.
And it is devastating. And I think going through step by step a legal process or an administrative process to address it it's sort of a different thing that runs parallel to your self-care and now what, right? And so getting and staying plugged into community and other allies and that support system, I think it's critical, because I think when you find yourself in the position, it makes it even harder to now try to figure out, who can I go to, who can I surround myself with? And so UNA Women's Affinity Group, I think, is a really great start.
Very good. What do the rest of you do? This is your person, this is your passion that you're engaged with. So how do you keep up with this to encourage other women?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I have to say, I find a lot of enthusiasm and really courage in many ways by the connection with some of the most fantastic women leaders, and when you talk to women around the world that are really stepping in, for example, the political life, or women journalists that work in countries where they know it is dangerous to do this job, but they believe it's important, and they are standing up and they are persisting no matter what. I think that this is just very energizing. I think that the way women get this problem and get the importance of this problem is very, very key. And I wish there were more men also as allies that would really understand the importance of this for their own sake, for democracy's sake, for the sake of the protection of their rights that they enjoy too. I think we are not there yet. And I will make just a simple, example that has really come up for me and materialized for me in these last days. We are about to launch a series of case studies, and so have been in contact with media and for the promotion of some of these materials to make sure that more people can see them. And I looked at our media outreach, and we have been lucky at She Persisted to be featured in some of the most authoritative media outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, and so on and so forth. Now, 100% of the editors and the journalists that have been involved in covering these stories have been women on our case. 100%. We have not, when we talk to male editors and journalists, it sounds like a niche issue. Now, you tell me how an issue pertaining to 51% of the world is actually niche.
That's the thing. We really do have to bring in the men. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think there's an initiative, he for she. We need to bring these he for she's in. Self-care, and then audience, we have some questions, we want to get to questions and answers. We want to leave some time for that. But just how can generally and individuals help and support? What would you say? What people need to engage with your organizations? I think we'll have your contact so they can engage with that. And the audience there, any other questions with that? So any other comments from you, Stephanie or Marina, before we go to questions and answers?
Sure, I'll just say from my perspective, we've talked a lot about how hard it can be to be in the public face, and I'm not saying that I'm necessarily in the public face, but serving in government certainly puts you in contact with a lot of different people, and your name is out there. I think it's really important, this is part of my own sort of reckoning every day, to emphasize, especially for the young people who may be tuning in, because I'm seeing some comments fly by about, oh, maybe nobody will ever want to enter into public service or into political life. Like, it is an enormous privilege to do the kind of work that we do. It is an enormous privilege to represent your government day in, day out, and to be proud of your government and the kind of policies that you help to shape. And so I think that at the risk of sounding at all trite, there's immense value in the work, and you just do it for as long as you're able to do.
Very good. Yes. Yes, Stephanie, any last words? Or we have some questions and answers, I think, Godfrey and Paula. Okay, Paula, you want to help us with some of the first questions?
Sure. We have about 6 questions here
Okay.
in the chat. Some coming from our board chair, Jill Christensen at UNANCA. She says, it would be valuable additions to how much men play into the equation of safe space within technology for women and girls. What specific examples can you point to with men as part of the solution and impacting safe culture? That's one.
Who wants to address that?
I can do that.
Okay.
So I had the privilege of working with the Space Force to stand up the Women's Initiative team within the Space Force. And so we worked hand in hand with another team that began STEM to Space every year, which targeted elementary school aged kids to expose them to STEM with the understanding and with sort of an emphasis on girls. And so we had a chance to facilitate this dialogue with the kids, boys and girls, but understanding that, you know, the dialogue with the girls were a little different with the boys in trying to close that digital gender divide. So it was a collective conversation, but we understood the different the different items that we really needed to dig into on both sides of the fence.
Thank you, that Cindy. Any other opportunities of addressing that, the male getting involved? Or how you're addressing that?
I mean, I think just, you know, the intersection of technology and gender, like I said, the gender gap is there. So any involvement with technology, you know, ultimately is involving men because they are in those positions. And yeah, I mean, making sure that we have language that is inclusive, makes, you know, talks about men as perpetrators, but then also as a solution, I think is really key. And also, as we bring in men, I think we also need to be very deliberate to make sure that we're still focusing on, in this specific space, on the needs of women and girls. Because oftentimes men do feel more comfortable to speak about their own perspectives. But I just want to say that, yeah, we should make sure that as we bring in men, we need to be deliberate about what issue we're working on.
Yes. Very good. Both perspectives. Next question, Paula.
From Lucina, for Lucina from Helen, what can we do to encourage young women to still be willing to enter politics? My daughter started talking in this way as politics students at university in the UK. I'm doing what I can, but it's hard.
Yeah, you know, I don't yeah, I can totally see how hard it is overall. You know, from the political field, I think there is this saying that I really like, which is sadly, if you're not on the table, if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. So the truth is that we still really do need more women to step up and being able to be represented in all places of power. While absolutely, I do hope we are gonna get to a world where, you know, men are gonna feel equally involved and equally, you know, outraged by gender inequality and will absolutely feel the need to speak on behalf of 100% of the population. I don't think we're gonna get there if women don't continue stepping up. So I do think it's really important for women to keep being involved. I am optimistic, actually, having interviewed very many women and girls around the world, of, you know, how they are committed to persisting. We just need to make sure that they are not silenced, and that, you know, technology doesn't make it even harder for them than it already is.
Very good. Have any more questions, Paula? I'm going to ask the panelists if you would put your email address in the chat so everyone will have your contact.
Sure, if you feel inclined to do so, absolutely. From Michaela, she's saying the impact of misogyny and gender violence promoted by online influencers on young men and boys, such as Andrew Tate, or on adults folks through hate speech in certain news media, is a form of propaganda that is difficult to address and contributes significantly to online gender-based violence. What are your suggestions for addressing these issues? This is for everyone in the panel who would like to address that.
Very quickly, with that 3 minutes.
I was going to say words matter, right? And so something that I have found, especially when it comes to navigating some of the, elusiveness with online bullying, it's putting words to what happened. And again, it can be really difficult. But when we do that, now we can sort of create the proof, if you will, and bring it to the proper authorities as to what happened. So now we're moving it from an emotional thing, or how someone can perceive this as an emotional thing, to a tangible problem, and we can put the words to it. And as we do that, that's really hard too, because now you're admitting that this happened, that you've been attacked. And I think that's where that community health and that mental health come into play. But I think putting the words to it so that when we communicate it, it's taken serious. So that's kind of what I found.
Anyone else want to address that?
Yeah, I guess I'm taking the technology side. I've realized I'm kind of in that place on the panel. Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about this content that's going online, like we need to recognize that it's not, every voice doesn't have an equal space online, and that these platforms are actually profiting off of these types of voices because they are so extreme. So it's that clickbait, right? The more you click on it, the more it goes to the top of the list. So recognizing that this type of business model is actually promoting this type of extreme content. So yeah, as much as we push back at an individual level, we also need to recognize that this is AI generated, and it gets to the business models of these corporations.
Very good, very good. I think this is the last question, Paul. I'm gonna ask everyone to give closing remarks. This is the last question. What would be an example of a practical response? Can I get all the panelists to answer that? In other words, how do you respond if someone tries to really bully you? Do you just ignore, you walk away, you say this, you say that, as well as your wrap up of today on what you want people to leave with?
I think Lucina might be the best place to answer that, or maybe Stephanie, but I can say from the government side at least, and this is not an individual side, and I wouldn't recommend necessarily that you take my advice, since I deleted Twitter from my personal devices. But I think that there's a lot more to do on the prevention side. I really want to underline something that Lucina mentioned earlier, which is that we have to take the onus off of the people who are experiencing the harassment, the abuse, the trolling, the violence, and we have to put it on not just the perpetrators, but the platforms that are allowing this to proliferate. And so that means we have to be thinking about prevention, right? We have to be thinking about, like, what are the kinds of filters that can actively filter, like, hate speech, violent speech, put it directly in a spam folder. How do you make it much, 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 much easier to report threats, right? It can't just be, oh, I'm going to block this. It has to be, actually, no, this, by just hitting this button, it screenshots it, it puts it in a queue. I get automated notifications about where I am in the queue, right? There are things that we can do. Secretary Albright, who is of course a hero at the State Department, said that this is tech's solvable problem. Like, this is imminently solvable. Second, we need to be investing resources and conversations like this and all around so that we're raising the awareness, but also so that we're defining better what that hate speech actually looks like, and not just in English, but in other languages as well, right? Like I think somebody else mentioned here that we're starting to do something around in English. We're not quite there in other languages. And we need to be working in partnership with civil society organizations who frankly know so much more about this as governments start to catch up. And then lastly, I personally, so I'm taking my government hat off entirely, but like we have to be thinking about how we're contributing to the response. We have to be thinking about what is the responsibility for women who and LGBTQ and girls who don't feel safe online, who have had to move houses, right? As a friend of mine has recently had to do due to really, really violent rape and death threats, had to move her entire company's IP address, had to move her entire physical house, had to move her entire family. And she had to pay for all of that. What is the responsibility for all of us when something like that is allowed to proliferate? So those are off the cuff remarks, but emphasizing that's my non-State Department hat. But that was really brought home for me at least how critical, how important this conversation is.
Thank you. We're 1 minute over. If you will indulge us for maybe 4 more minutes, I want one-word answers of your charge to people who are listening now. Cindy, one word, telling the people who are listeners, individuals, stakeholders of what to do, or a phrase.
There's power in numbers.
Power in numbers. Stephanie.
Safety by design.
By design. Okay, excellent. Lucina.
Always persist.
Always persist. She persists. Always, never gives up. Marina, any other one phrase from you?
I think I brought us over, but I guess you could just say, keep speaking.
Keep speaking. I say, use your inside voice. Be in the room. You're free to be who you're called to be, and voices carry the truth. So thank you all for being on here. Paula, any last closing remarks? Come on. No closing remarks. You've been wonderful, excellent. Some emails are in the chat. Reach out, get involved, take your place, because we're all here as this village to really get this job done. And we can do. Place a woman anywhere in the world, she'll move the world. See you next time.
You have said it all, Yvonne. Excellent. Thank you so much to
Thank you
all
all.
and each one of you.
Thank you all.
Stay in touch.